Hey everyone. In our series this week, we're focusing on imperialism in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. We'll also talk about imperialism in the Pacific. Quick timeline of what's happening in the part of the world that we're focusing on. So take a moment, review. And let's begin by discussing how imperialism actually happened. It starts with German unification. The unification of Germany in 1871 had implications for world politics as well as Europe. Britain already had a large world empire thanks to centuries of focusing on maritime trade, domination of world finance, and early industrialization. There were also economic factors that pushed new imperialism, and the Second Industrial Revolution led corporations to invest money in the new chemical and metal industries. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called the Berlin Conference on Africa in 1884 and 85 to lay out the framework under which Africa would be occupied by the top European nations of France, Britain, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. In practice, the division and occupation of Africa met with resistance and required many years of effort. Africa was divided among the European powers. Not a single African was at the conference, and no people in Africa, no kingdoms, no governments were consulted about where the boundaries were to be drawn. In West Africa, the new colonial powers took advantage of and developed the existing trade networks. In Equatorial Africa, where there were few inhabitants and little trade, the colonial powers granted concessions to private companies that forced Africans to produce cash crops and to carry them to the nearest navigable river or railroad. You guys are familiar with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and survival of the fittest. Darwin developed a new framework for understanding how natural history worked. Based on his theory of how natural selection powers evolution, Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. Darwin was searching for the mechanism that drove evolution, and he believed that life originated and was shaped by a competition for survival. Darwin applied his theory to humanity in The Descent of Man in 1871. Both Karl Marx and Charles Darwin were interpreted as reflecting a broader belief in progress. Social Darwinism took Darwin's ideas out of the realm of nature and applied them to the realm of the marketplace and society as a whole. The new imperialism revived mercantilist economic policies. Social Darwinism argued that races and nations were in a struggle with one another for survival. Christian missionaries were also influenced by racist beliefs such as social Darwinism. And some missionaries believed in the spiritual capacities of Africa and Native people. And at the forefront of this movement was the London Missionary Society, which sent David Livingstone to Africa to explore, to document, and to forge relationships. And if you've ever heard the saying or the famous historical statement, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, it's because he went missing for a number of years. People thought he was dead. They sent in a search party. No, he was still alive. He just wasn't answering letters. All right, so this is what Africa looks like after the Berlin Conference. And as you can see, France and Great Britain have large pieces of Africa. Belgium has the Congo. Germany has a few states as well. Italy has certain areas, as does Portugal and Spain, much smaller areas. And then what's important to remember, we talked a bit about Ethiopia and how they managed to retain independence, as well as Liberia. Later, we're also going to touch on Sierra Leone. In southern Africa, King Khama III was king of the Bangweto people of southern Africa. In 1895, Khama and two neighboring kings went on a long diplomatic mission to London. Discovery of diamonds and gold brought more Europeans, and this led to an era of new imperialism. Khama wanted the British government to proclaim a proctorate, and the colonial secretary argued in Khama's favor. Khama's situation was typical. All of Africa had to negotiate or be overwhelmed by European powers. Before the Dutch settled at Cape Town, the Bantu-speaking peoples of the highlands of southern Africa had centralized chiefdoms. Khama was successful in negotiating some autonomy for his people. And King Kama the Third is a case study and just one of many numerous examples of existing kingdoms that are being completely overrun and destroyed in some cases because of imperialism. Coming at the same time is also serious droughts that are hitting the coastlands of southeastern Africa in the early 19th century. And this led to conflicts over grazing and farming lands. During these conflicts, a ruler named Shaka used strict military drill and close combat warfare to build the famous Zulu kingdom. In the late 18th century, there was an increase of internal warfare. And Shaka, who would reign over the Zulu kingdom between 1820 and 1828, created the most successful of these combined states and forged what would be called the Zulu Empire. Shaka created a very powerful military with a standing army. The Zulu Empire was built by conquering neighboring chiefdoms. The English had taken over Cape Town from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. The Zulu remained politically independent until the 1870s. Some neighboring Africans created their own states, such as Swaziland and Lesotho, to protect themselves against the expansionist Zulu kingdom. Shaka ruled the Zulu, and while he ruled, he succeeded in creating a new national identity as well as a new kingdom. Incredibly impressive considering he ruled for less than a decade. The Cape Colony that had been taken from the Dutch was valuable to Britain because of its strategic importance as a supply station on the route to India. In response to British pressure, the descendants of the earlier French and Dutch settlers, called the Afrikaners, embarked on a great trek to found new colonies on the fertile high veld that had been depopulated by the Zulu Wars. Southern Africa had long been attractive to European settlers because of its good pastures and farmland, as well as its mineral wealth. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in 1868 attracted European prospectors and Africans. And it also, pardon me, it also set up the process by which the British Cape Colony expanded, annexing Kimberley and defeating the Xhosa and the Zulu. After the Boers and the British overwhelmed these two tribes, they began expanding and conquering other African chiefdoms. The Xhosa tried unsuccessfully to negotiate or resist the European expansion, but they were further weakened by Europeans' killing of their cattle. Nonkawusa was a young Xhosa prophet who said ancestors wanted to kill remaining cattle, and if they did, the ancestors would be able to defeat the Europeans. Unfortunately, this did not work. Cecil Rhodes shows up on the scene. He's a British mining entrepreneur and an advocate for a larger British empire, and he used his British South Africa Company to take over land in Central Africa, where he created the colonies of Northern and Southern Rhodesia. He founded the richest diamond mining company in South Africa. Rhodes used his British South Africa Company as a charter company. British control of South Africa was consolidated when the British defeated the Afrikaners in the South African War. It's also called the Boer War. That would last between 1899 and 1902. In 1910, the European settlers created the Union of South Africa, in which the Afrikaners emerged as the ruling element in a government that assigned Africans to reservations and established a system of racial segregation. You may have heard of this. It's called apartheid, which literally means to keep apart. This is Africa in the 19th century. So some of these empires that we've studied, we're going to come back later and talk about the Sokoto Caliphate. There is resistance within the entire continent, and we'll also talk more about that later. East, West, and Equatorial Africa. In West Africa, movements to purify Islam led to the construction of new states through the classic Muslim pattern of jihad, which means a holy war. The largest of these reform movements occurred in the Hausa states and led to the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate, which would last from 1809 to 1906. The new Muslim states became centers of Islamic learning and reform. Sokoto, as well as other Muslim states, used both sold slaves and used slaves to raise food and thus it made it possible for them to seclude free Muslim women in their homes in accordance with the reformed Muslim practice. So they're selling them and they're buying slaves, focusing on the purpose of raising food, which was traditionally a woman's job. Sufi reformers believed their version of the faith was pure and devoted to the earliest form of Islam. Usman Dan Fodio, who lived from 1754 to 1817, was a jihad leader out of Nigeria. The jihadist movements focused on reforming local Muslim leaders, and Muslim resistance to the French was led by Samori Touré. Samori built an army near the upper Niger by using imported European rifles. In 1884, Samora declared himself to be a commander of the faithful and led a jihad against Muslims as well as unbelievers. He also oppressed the local people who did not support him against the French. In 1893, he was captured and exiled, and the French controlled from the Senegal to the Niger rivers. The British felt that their control of Egypt and the Nile Valley was threatened by the expansion of the French. The West African states were more vulnerable to the European imperialists because they did not form alliances with one another. In West Africa, the French built a railroad from the upper Senegal River to the upper Niger to open the interior to French merchants, which expanded their influence. Henry Morton Stanley represented the new imperialist views of Africans. Stanley was convinced, unlike Livingstone, that the people of Africa could not be civilized and that they were savage. Stanley was a journalist and viewed Africa as a place of personal opportunity. And that's how he was able to form an alliance with King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold sent Stanley with the Belgian military to claim the region around the Congo River. Rubber was used in the early 19th century for conveyor belts in factories and waterproof clothing. In the Congo, King Leopold forced the natives to harvest rubber. European countries began to complain about how Leopold was treating the people of the Congo, because under his regime, the soldiers' brutal treatment and greed led to the deaths of over 10 million Congolese. We will be talking more about that in class. European merchants purchased palm oil from West African merchants, and many abolitionists and missionaries hoped this legitimate trade would end the slavery in Africa. When British patrols ended the slave trade on the Atlantic coast, slave traders in the Atlantic trade began to purchase slaves from the East African markets that had traditionally supplied slaves to North Africa and the Middle East. Zanzibar Island and neighboring territories ruled by the Sultan of Oman were important in the slave trade, the ivory trade, and the cultivation of cloves on plantations using slave labor. So a quick review. We've talked about Egypt in our last two series. Muhammad Ali, who reigned from 1805 to 1848, carried out a series of modernizing reforms for Egypt that combined Western methods with Islamic religious and cultural traditions. Muhammad Ali's grandson, Ismail, placed even more emphasis on westernizing Egypt. His ambitious construction program, railroads, a new capital city of Cairo, were funded by borrowing from the French and British banks. These projects were financed with high-interest loans from European creditors. And Egypt ultimately sold shares of the Suez Canal to Great Britain to lower their debt. The Suez Canal had been constructed as a joint English-French venture in 1869, and it linked the Mediterranean and Red Seas. French and British bankers lobbied their governments to intervene in Egypt to secure their loans. In 1882, the British sent an army into Egypt and established a system of indirect rule that lasted for 70 years. The British worked to develop Egyptian agriculture, especially cotton production, by building a dam across the Nile at Aswan. The economic development of Egypt only benefited a small group of elite landowners and merchants, and it was accompanied by the introduction of Western ways that conflicted with the teachings of Islam. In the mid to late 19th century, Ethiopian kings had reconquered territory that had been lost since the 16th century. Purchased by European weapons, and Ethiopian kings also ordered the manufacturing of weapons locally. King Menelik II, who reigned from 1889 to 1913, took measures to strengthen the state. Similarly to Japan, Ethiopia decided to modernize and reform its government in order to prevent a European takeover. In 1808, news of slave revolts like that on San Domingo and the activities of abolitionists combined to lead Britain and the US to prohibit their citizens from participating in the slave trade. The British used their navy to stop the slave trade, but the continued demand for slaves in Cuba and Brazil meant that the trade did not end until 1867. As the slave trade declined, Africans expanded their legitimate trade in gold and other goods. The most successful new export was palm oil, which was exported to the British manufacturers of soap, candles, and lubricants. The increased export of palm oil altered the social structure of coastal trading communities on the Niger Delta, as it demonstrated in the career of canoe slave Jaja, who ended up becoming a wealthy palm oil trader in the 1870s. Through the use of palm oil, he was able to buy his own freedom and build an empire based upon palm oil. The suppression of the slave trade also helped to spread Western cultural values in West Africa. Missionaries converted and founded schools for the recaptives whom the British settled in Sierra Leone, while Black Americans brought Western culture to Liberia and to other parts of Africa before and after emancipation in the United States. All right, we're going to stop there for today. In our next podcast, we'll pick up with India being ruled by the British. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. Cheers.